surface temperature of Venus is 900 degrees Fahrenheit. That's hotter than a baker's oven. Lead would be molten at that temperature. And when it rains sulfuric acid.
So they found a layer in Venus's atmosphere that's not so high temperature, not so high pressure, and it's sort of just right. You can imagine like a Goldilocks zone in the atmosphere that could sustain molecules of biology.
NASA's records from the 1960s have shown the space agency calling Venus a planet from hell. At the same time, Mars became a human destination. Such careful labeling of the innermost planets isn't a coincidence. During the turbulent space race of the same era, the Soviet Union was fixated on sending costly missions to Venus. The hellish planet showed little to no prospects for life, yet the Soviet space program didn't decommission the Venera program until the fall of the empire, gathering images from Venus that were sealed. Why were these images declassified? And how successful were the missions to Venus? Join us as we uncover the declassified photos from Venus revealed by Neil Degrasse Tyson that were never seen before. The USSR fascination with the hellish planet. The fall of the Soviet Union was dynamic in more ways than one. The loss of the legendary empire not only changed the geopolitical course of the world, but also sank many secrets with it. It is known that the Soviets had a deep affinity for secrets. From running the most advanced intelligence agency in the world to being quiet about their potential alien contact, the former world power carries numerous mysteries within itself, and believe it or not, before the United States of America took over most of the planetary efforts in outer space, the Soviet Union was at the helm of affairs. The empire has a long history of successful and unsuccessful space missions, but its biggest fixation to date was one inner hellish planet, Venus, known in the Russian language as Venera, and hence the subsequent name of the mission that spanned from 1961 to 1983. It was about this same time that the United States of America was busy sending its mission to the moon. So, in a very strategic manner, the Soviets decided to use their resources elsewhere, and one can say that the entire obsession with the second planet from our sun was rather odd. Did the Soviets plan on using the planet's surface as a viable and unbeatable military base? Or were they possibly looking to colonize the planet after searching for any forms of life up there? It's quite hard to understand why the empire was obsessed with the hellish planet in the first place, since the Soviets commissioned these exploration voyages during the Cold War. Their aims and objectives weren't exactly open to a single interpretation. In fact, everything we know about the missions to Venus is due to unarchived and declassified evidence. Even then, it's hard to point out exactly what the Soviets were searching for, and if they cracked the secret missions because the empire landed on Venus, not once, twice, or 3 times. The Soviets launched exactly 28 pricey spacecraft to the hellish planet, and 13 of those entered the Venusian atmosphere, while 8 had successful landings. Such sophisticated missions catapulted the empire in a leading position to spearhead the space exploration initiative. There's no doubt that the United States of America was a close first too, but NASA was more interested in satellites and technological configuration than exploring life on planets. Its affection for Mars only came later, so while history textbooks might not contain this, it is established that the Soviet space program was the first agency to send a probe into the atmosphere of a planet other than Earth, and it has another bunch of firsts on its resume as well. The defunct USSR was also the first state to make a soft landing on another planet. It commissioned the first initiative that brought back images and sounds from the surface of other planets. So yeah, the Soviets had their own moment of small steps for a man, a giant leap for mankind. That too was well before the US, so how come we rarely get to read about such landmark missions very rarely? Remember what was mentioned earlier about the Soviet affinity for keeping secrets? It turns out that's just one of the many reasons behind the censorship of the Soviet space program. Back in 1992, the popular agency was decommissioned in the aftermath of the USSR, as the agency had to be revived with its new Russian identity, Roscosmos. A lot of its archival data was either lost or destroyed. This is exactly why we don't have a clear-cut answer for why the Soviets launched 28 spacecraft into the Venusian atmosphere. But if we had to make the most logical guess, perhaps the Soviet decision to explore Venus was about cost efficiency more than anything else. This is not to say that the space program wasn't optimistic about the habitability of the planet. They were looking for sustainable water presence, intensity of solar radiation, and the overall temperament of the planet. Without a series of these space missions, it would have been next to impossible to gauge Venus's high temperatures and thick atmosphere. Of course, today many cosmologists don't believe that the hellish planet can support life. The temperatures up there are high enough to melt lead, and well water is scarce. Plus, due to its thick atmosphere, the air pressure on Venus is 90 times that of our planet Earth. But these are quite recent and modern tidings, and to disregard the USSR's contribution to the study of Venus is equivalent to censoring history. As far as the Soviets were concerned, Venus was worth exploring even if it was just about galvanizing the space race. Exploring more habitable planets like Mars wasn't exactly off the table, but it was more costly than probing into Venus. Everything just boils down to the distance from planet Earth to any other cosmological body. On average, the hellish planet is only 40 million kilometers away from our home, while Mars on average is 250 million kilometers away. Such vast differences in distance amount to drastic differences in the costs as well. If the United States of America wasn't the world's largest economy, it wouldn't have been easy to explore Mars. Other rumors on the block also suggest that the Soviet missions were unreliable and had massive technical gaps. Apparently, the spacecraft wasn't suitable to cover astronomical distances. Plus, the agency had a bad trajectory of losing contact with its spacecraft, so it makes sense why the Soviet space program was opting for a shorter and closer transit that would actually yield results. If we don't bring up the space race in this context, the story of Venera missions would be incomplete. What propelled the Soviet Union's obsession with Venus, and how successful were they? The space race between USA and USSR. The United States of America wasn't even in the game when the Soviet program was first launched, the first artificial satellite Sputnik 1 in 1957. This particular maneuver had intensified the geopolitical standing between the two contesting superpowers post-World War II. The world had recontextualized what it meant to be the guiding light in the global community. A throne that was lucrative demanded that either of the superpowers would exert their power on all fronts, and space was no exception, as the Soviet space program was quick and successful. Dwight Eisenhower, President of the U.S., signed the National Aeronautics and Space Act in 1958, triggering the space race. NASA was born, the committee was centralized around American space exploration, but more importantly, the country's sheer dominance. These two events, which happened back-to-back, have shaped the cosmological pursuits we know today. It's also worth noting that both of the parties involved were obsessed with nailing their landmark moment to claim the space race lead. For what it's worth, the iconic 1969 moon landing was a major feather in NASA's celebrated hat. Even back then, there was a lot of hysteria about the authenticity of the Apollo mission. Many Soviet space experts claimed that the U.S. had orchestrated the landing to aggravate the space tussle to maintain its hegemony. But what's really interesting is why the U.S. had fixated itself on the moon in the first place. Uncharted territory aside, NASA had a series of failures with its Venus missions in the 1960s and so on. The U.S. Space Agency had found itself in a deadlock called the Venus Curse. Every time they launched a probe into the Venusian atmosphere, it went horribly wrong. This is precisely when the Soviet Union saw an opportunity to capitalize on NASA's failures. At that time, both the US and USSR were hell-bent on claiming the space race. The most logical venture was to steer away with two different options. It was a silent agreement. Very strategically, the Soviet space program took hold of the Earth's sister planet. For the agency, the biggest landmark in the space tussle was to do something that its competitive counterpart had failed to do. Despite the empire's limited resources and mismanaged government, it repeatedly sent missions to Venus to find its winning position against the US. As opposed to that, NASA had taken hold of Moon's mission. But of course, this strategic partition wasn't without hostility and propaganda. To cover up their colossal failures with Venus, the American agency was incentivized to defame the USSR's fixation with the planet. In Americanized popular media, Venus was dubbed as the hellish planet while Mars became man's destiny. These connotations didn't matter to the Soviets, though. Their only objective was to show superiority to the Americans. And well, they weren't unsuccessful in doing so. The Venera missions are almost forgotten in today's history. However, despite their dated emergence, those missions were highly sophisticated, advanced, and ambitious. In fact, if we have to pick an event that marked the dawn of the space age, the Venera explorations will definitely take the lead. Back in the 1950s, the Soviets began to experiment with the design and construction specifics of the probes, and for the next 30 years, they kept building and launching interplanetary spacecraft as part of the Venera program. Since the program was running parallel with the highly turbulent Cold War, the Soviets were obsessed with optimizing their resources. Luckily for them, the early years of the war gave them more heavy lifting capacity than the United States of America. That advantage proved to be super beneficial. Maximizing on their capabilities, the USSR started to build and launch bigger spacecraft that were designed to maintain high altitudes and distances. The Soviets were quick to experiment with both manned and unmanned spacecraft. At the same time, the Soviet space program began to use 4 stage rockets and advanced telemetry systems that launched their spacecraft to new heights, quite literally. Let's not forget that the USSR was carrying such space expeditions in the 1950s. Needless to say, our technological landscape was still coming to terms with outer space exploration and landing on planets that weren't Earth. Exploring the innermost planets wasn't an easy feat, but the USSR was pretty persistent with technological advancements that were either hits or misses. Yet the empire had created a strong tendency for looping in its error, for better and more resilient spacecraft, and the thick atmosphere of Venus didn't make their jobs any easier. But the show went on. Venera 1, the first interplanetary flight. It was quite obvious that the Soviet Union was looking to make a defining statement with their first probe, designed for the unfriendly Venusian atmosphere, Venera 1, or at times dubbed Sputnik 8 in Western academia. The space probe was launched on February 12, 1961, making it the first interplanetary flight of our lifetime. By design, Venera 1 weighed in at a spectacular 1,400 pounds, which was a testament to the Soviet mastery in spacecrafts. Not too long ago, the Soviet space program triggered the space race with their satellite Sputnik 1, which only weighed 184 pounds. The massive jump in the scale of the space expedition as well as the spacecraft itself was pretty impressive. No wonder the US had felt threatened by the Soviet ambitions in space, and by all accounts, Venera 1 was a sight to see. If you were witnessing the launch of the space mission today, you'd be quick to notice its spitting resemblance to Doctor Who's Daleks. Before you get into the debate of who copied whom, BBC only released the fictional series in 1963, so as much fun as the theory sounds, no engineer at the Soviet space program was in love with a figment of Western media. The probe was stabilized and equipped with sophisticated instruments like a magnetometer, Geiger counters, and micrometeorite detectors. As per astronomy.com, and like many of its successors, the interior of the probe was pressurized to just over 1 atmosphere with nitrogen gas to help the instruments function at a stable temperature. Such specs might not sound too lucrative in today's age because we are making strides on Mars every single day. But the fact that the Soviets were able to churn up a progressive spacecraft with the 1950s scraps is undeniably remarkable. Yet unfortunately, Venera 1 couldn't live up to the hype. The first attempt to launch the probe was disastrous, and frankly, pretty humiliating for the Soviet space mission in a series of devastating events. The probe didn't even make it out of the Earth's orbit. The second and official attempt to launch Venera 1 came about on February 12, 1961, and it had its highs and lows. Fortunately, the probe flew past Venus in May 1961, becoming the first space mission to achieve the incredible feat. However, the Soviet space program lost all contact with Venera 1 before the flyby. It only touched down with the hellish planet, which occurred about 62,000 miles or 100,000 kilometers. Yet the probe didn't return any data to the Soviets. By today's standards, it is perhaps convenient to regard Venera 1 as a major flop. After all, it didn't exactly achieve what T was designed to achieve. However, even in a contemporary setting, we'll give the probe a significant point for making that risky flight. Not to mention the Soviets were literally sending the spacecraft into the unknown. Venera 2 through 13, failures and eventual success. Before the successful iterations of the Venera mission, we had little to no idea about the planet's atmosphere. Perhaps this is why Venera 2 wasn't a whopping stamp of success either. The probe had a similar design to its predecessor, and this mission was the same as well. It was supposed to fly past Venus, record critical information about the planet, transmit it back to Earth, and return home. On November 12, 1965, Venera 2 was launched into space with optimistic ambitions, and Soviets were joyful to see that the probe had completed its flyby on February 27, 1966. The mission was 15,000 miles or 24,000 kilometers away from the Earth's sister planet. The probe hadn't even made its journey back, and it was already doing better than its predecessor. But then the same old problem got the best of Venera 2 as well. Due to a radiator malfunction and overheating, the probe lost its trajectory as well. On March 4, 1966, the mission was officially declared lost, and once again, the Soviets couldn't get their hands on any viable data. When it came down to designing Venera 3 to Venera 6, the Soviets knew they had to solve the overheating problem by the end of 1969. The space program had grappled with the unprecedented temperatures at Venus, so a few clarifications here. The first probes were monumental in defining the tough and rough terrain of the hellish planet. Space engineers in the USSR had some idea about the modifications they needed to make for their probes to survive callous heat. With Venera 3, the space agency was successful in cracking the overheating problem. The probe was designed to make a smooth landing on the planet's surface to achieve a remarkable feat for the Empire. Yet instead, the mission crashed into the planet, making it another failure for the USSR. Even at the crux of the Cold War, as well as the Union's booming financial hurdles, the space agency was determined to make some successful strides in its mission. And well, let's just say persistence paid off. Not in the way you might deem it a success story, though. Venera 4 also succumbed to the planet's lethal heat and thick atmospheric pressure, not before doing its job, though. The mission spent 90 minutes collecting data for its creators before it gradually transcended into the planet's dense atmosphere. For the most part, the space agency was able to detect very high levels of carbon dioxide in the air. The space engineers also figured out that the planet didn't have any magnetic field at all. After the mild success of Venera 4, astronomers and planetary scientists expected the USSR to fix its focus elsewhere. The elevated levels of greenhouse gas in the air are usually a bad metric for habitability. To be fair, the Soviet Union was yet to pool in resources for other space missions that could have required more interplanetary flights, just not to Venus. However, it was almost as if the Soviet Space Agency wasn't ready to accept defeat just yet. For the next few years, the space program launched Venera 5 and Venera 6 to mark its monumental success with its ambitious mission. Both probes transmitted back data for almost an hour while parachuting through Venus's thick atmosphere, and that 50 minutes of data was a huge moment of celebration for the USSR. Yet it came with devastating tidings, too. For the first time, Soviet space engineers were able to fully investigate the atmospheric composition of the hellish planet. And while the moniker hellish planet was a product of the US propaganda, it stayed true to its characterization. It turned out that Venus isn't suitable to host life. Its shell-like temperature, thick atmospheric pressure, and unbreathable air aren't a match for its twin planet. All hopes for the Soviet Union came crashing down, but this is where the Soviet obsession with Venus takes an unexplainable and twisted turn. Even after gathering enough intel on the planet's low habitability, the USSR couldn't let go of its infatuation with Venus. There's not enough to go by here, at least that's what it looks like on the outlook. But if the Empire's declassified documents and photos from Venera are anything to go by, you'd see that the space agency had a change in its motivations. We don't know when exactly this switch happened, but there's a huge possibility that the Soviets had stopped searching for life on the planet after Venera 5 mainly because they found a higher purpose up there, researching the existence of astrobiological beings on the planet. And by the looks of it, the USSR was way ahead of the US. Until 2021, the US didn't have any clear-cut idea about Venus and its potential to host life that isn't just human. If we had to make a guess, we'd say that the Soviets were waiting for technology to catch up with them. After Venera 7 and Venera 8 made successful landings on the planet, the space program took their initiative up a notch. Out of all missions to the Venusian territory, Venera 9 through Venera 12 would always hold the utmost importance in the history of interplanetary interaction. These missions, despite their ups and downs, were able to capture images of Venus's surface, and the Soviets couldn't be more ecstatic. They were no longer interested in creating life on a hellish planet. Their goals readily shifted to finding life on a planet that had been discarded by the other space agencies of its time, such as NASA. Even though the US had sent multiple successful missions to Venus in the 1980s, it wasn't exactly interested in finding life up there. It's true that NASA had a remarkable recovery with their Flop Venus probes. American missions like Pioneer 12 and the wildly successful Magellan had brought NASA into a profound limelight. However, at the same time, the space agency was putting more resources and capital into its extravagant deployment to the Moon, an area where the USSR had failed multiple times. The Soviet space program was hopeful for finding forms of life in the floating clouds of the planet. We still can't be sure if the Soviets were successful in their mission or not. The success of the Venera probes was largely celebrated by the USSR, but when it came to intricate details, most of their robust findings were pushed under the rug. Owing to the economic stagnation from 1975 to 1984, the empire had to reconfigure its priorities. The country was heading toward a complete economic collapse and had to deprioritize the space race to tend to matters back home. It's not surprising that before the dissolution of the USSR, the state had lost considerable lead in the space tussle. Running out of spare money was monumental in slowing down the Soviet space program. Naturally, the United States took over then, but not before the Soviets had made considerable strides in interplanetary efforts. We don't think it is just a massive coincidence that more and more scientists are challenging the inhabitable status of Venus. As it stands, today scientists believe that Venus once had a viable capacity to host life. NASA believes that the hellish planet had oceanic water in its distant past, indicating the existence of astrobiological forms of life on Venus. Since Venus formed out of ingredients similar to that of Earth, the scientists were hopeful about the planet's evolutionary path. Sure, it was disappointing that the planet's thick atmospheric blanket trapped a poisonous gas, but the phenomenon is more recent than we realize. Not to mention, back in 2020, NASA also confirmed the presence of phosphine on Venus. This smelly, flammable gas was wafting through the clouds on Venus, and if scientists are correct, it should have annihilated any life forms on the planet that rely on oxygen for survival. While it sounds dangerous, ironically enough, the presence of a lethal gas on Venus is the most robust biosignature that scientists have been hunting for. The idea is pretty controversial, but as National Geographic puts it, phosphine is also made naturally by some species of anaerobic bacteria organisms that live in the oxygen-starved environments of landfills, marshlands, and even animal guts. To say that no one saw this coming would be a half-baked lie, because for decades the Soviets were obsessed with finding something groundbreaking on Venus. Perhaps it was just a hunch, or maybe the USSR was operating on strong data evidence. But the truth is that it was the first and the only space agency in the world to put its resources into exploring the planet up close. The presence of phosphine is pretty debatable for sure. While a big cohort of planetary scientists believe that the lethal gas is present on the hellish planet, there are some small discrepancies too. This is where Neil Degrasse Tyson comes in. A huge proponent of discovering new habitable planets, Tyson labeled the discovery as something groundbreaking. In his conversation with the astrobiologist David Grinspoon, Neil hailed the presence of phosphine on Venus, and he wants everyone to pay attention to the cause as well. We might not be populating Venus anytime soon, And the Russian idea of floating cities in the planet's clouds might sound very ridiculous, but the important point here is that to gauge a planet's capacity to host life just through its atmosphere is a foreign and effective idea. There are many exoplanets that scientists are currently scavenging to find extraterrestrial life. Our limiting technology and the vastness of space don't allow us to send rapid missions to these exoplanets. But if we can make some calculated guesses about a planet's habitability by observing its atmosphere, then we should take our chances too. At least that's what Tyson believes. Because of this, the discovery of phosphine has started a new age of astronomical interest in Venus. It'll be next to impossible to live through the poisonous air in Venus, but we can hopefully learn more about the planet's history or potential contact with extraterrestrial beings. While we are still speculating, we can count on Soviet missions to give us a head start. As it stands today, NASA and other space agencies are still hunting for astrobiological life forms on the hellish planet. The declassified photos. The declassified photos from the Venera mission, which were not seen before, show that the Soviets had encountered some sort of living organisms during Venera 13, and old scientists from the Empire are also opening up about their adventurous times up there. It is at this point that the name Dr. Leonid Xanfomalady comes in. He is a senior researcher and a head of the laboratory on photometry and thermal radiometry at the Space Research Institute and Russian Academy of Sciences. Dr. Xanfomalady also played a major contributing role to Venera missions from the 1970s to the 1980s. In his groundbreaking research paper, the scientists revealed that Venera 13 was able to accomplish much more than a smooth landing on the planet. If you re-examine the panoramic images from the mission, you'd observe three objects that appeared to have characteristics of living organisms. For the decades prior, these photographs were highly confidential and classified. After the Russian scientists started to renew their interest in the hellish planet, only then was such data brought into the spotlight. It's being speculated that the Soviets kept the photographs secretive and classified because they couldn't have risked the US messing up with their trajectory. In reality, Venera 13 made a successful landing on Venus in the Novka Planitia, in the eastern part of Phoebe Reggio. In an incredible effort, the mission survived for 127 minutes and returned some high-resolution and sophisticated images of the planet's surface. A Russian researcher reanalyzed the pictures taken by Venera 13's cameras, V131 and V13-2. In his words, there were a few relatively large objects that were found with varying sizes ranging from a decimeter to half-meter, and with unusual morphology. The objects were observed on some images but were absent on others, or altered their shape. Dr. Xanfomalady talked about three major objects that he was able to take a closer look at. In the first series of photographers, the researcher analyzes a disc-type creature that was susceptible to change in heat or pressure. The second creature is some sort of a black rag that was visible from the probe in the first 13 minutes of the mission. Upon a closer look, the black rag was a vertically elongated black object that looked foreign to Earth. In the images taken in the 27th and 36th minute of the mission, the black rag disappeared without a trace. And lastly, Soviets' prized possession was the discovery of an extraterrestrial scorpion that changed the trajectory of the planet. In the unclassified photos, we can see the frightening creature stuttering around the surface of the hellish planet. Around the 90th minute of the mission, the V131 camera took a clear-cut image of the scorpion whose origins are alien or astrobiological. The resurfaced images have ignited a new light into Roscosmos, the Russian space agency. In the new age of space exploration, Moscow has claimed Venus to be its home planet, and by 2029, the country aims on sending a conclusive mission to the planet to explore it up close. So obviously, in spite of all the hurdles faced by the defunct USSR, the mission to Venus is still very much alive, and we can expect more in the future. Thanks for watching. Check out another interesting video by clicking on the link appearing on your screen right now. See you on the other side.